First of all, let me welcome our panelists for this second session. You have a tough job. I have a tough job. We're between Mrs. Lagarde and Mr. Jim Yong Kim. So we'll try our very best to make it for an animated conversation. The next hour, we will be actually discussing core issues that you have on the program today, which is very much how to collaborate and innovate to improve development outcomes. You will have a chance to ask questions to the panel. I would like us to be as conversational as possible, as direct as possible. If possible, I would also ask you for your questions to be directed to the whole of the panel rather than to individuals. So I will not stop any direct questions. But without further more introduction, let me introduce each of the panelists. First, Carolina Barco. Carolina was appointed Foreign Minister of Colombia by President Uribe in 2002 and remained in that post until 2006, when she was appointed ambassador to the United States. She joined the Inter-American Development Bank in October 2010 and helped develop the Emerging and Sustainable Cities Initiative, of which she's now an advisor. Carolina is also a commissioner of the International Commission of Missing Persons and a member of the board of the Colombian International Cooperation Agency. Alexander Cummings. Alexander is the Executive Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer of the Coca-Cola Company. Born in Liberia, he joined Coca-Cola in 1997 as a regional manager in Nigeria. He previously held several positions with the Pillsbury Company. He currently serves on the boards of CARE and Clark at Atlanta University and is a board member of S&C Johnson & Son and Coca-Cola Bottling Company. He's also a member of the Executive Leadership Council. Raymond Offenheiser is, and Ray is his name for everybody, has been president of Oxfam America for over 15 years. He's a member of Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network and a coalition, which is a coalition of development leaders who advocate for more effective foreign assistance. Ray is also a founder of the One Campaign and has served on boards and advisory council for organizations, including the Council of Foreign Relations, the Clinton Foundations, the World Economic Forum. I'll jump to Ray immediately for the icebreaker. I will ask each of the panelists the same question. Into collaborating and innovating for development outcomes, what has in your mind changed the most? What are the game changers that you've witnessed in the past and that you see influencing the future?
Well, thanks so much, Alex, and thanks to the Bretton Woods Committee for the opportunity to join you all today. Well, I think maybe the stage setter, I think, for this whole conversation is what's happening in the broader development landscape. And I think we're seeing a lot of sort of historic change. You could say, go so far as to say we're at an inflection point in the way that landscape is changing. We're seeing diminished funds, in particular shifts from one region to another. Latin America particularly is losing donor funds as emerging economies are moving forward and the perception is the funds aren't needed. Movement to Africa and South Asia for major investments now from the funders. We're seeing the repurposing of aid, more of a sense that we want to leverage partnerships and collaboration rather than fund specific projects, with not-for-profits or consulting firms in new and different ways. We're seeing corporations seeing themselves as development actors. I've had that conversation with colleagues at Coca-Cola on thinking about how they leverage their business models to perform in different kinds of ways. We're seeing the emergence of extractive industries as a major force for growth in the developing world, raising all sorts of questions about what does that mean for developing economies. And we're seeing new sources of revenue in countries, both from domestic sources, taxation, as well as sovereign wealth funds, new foreign investment, and new corporate presence. So for all of us, I think that has some significance in terms of how we think about who we're working with, how we're working with those new actors that are on the stage, foundations, new investors, corporations, what skill sets we need, and what we're actually doing. I mean, just to give you one example, Oxfam historically has not necessarily had a large focus on the private sector, but we have recognized that foreign direct investment far outstrips and probably will continue to outstrip foreign aid over the next several decades. So we have developed a large private sector initiative that involves working on global norms, that involves working on, in partnerships with different corporations on specific kinds of programs, and a variety of other initiatives to look at supply chain performance and how pro-poor or pro-development it may or may not be. So those are just a variety of, I think, opening insights that maybe get the conversation going, Alex.
Can I ask, maybe you raised the private sector and collaboration with the private sector. Could I ask Alexander to comment on that?
Sure. I think some of what has changed is the fact that the private sector recognizes that it has a role in helping communities where we live and work, where we do business. I also think more broadly, the individual actors, government, civil society, and business recognize that they bring different skills to bear to development. And this recognition and acknowledgement is part of what's changing the landscape. So in our case, we clearly recognize that we have to be parts of the communities where we live and work. We also realize we have limitations what we can and can't do. We recognize that NGOs and civil society play a critical role in development, as do governments. So working together, we think, is a solution, collaborating to solving the developmental challenges. And that acknowledgement and recognition is one of the changes that's taking place in the environment.
Yes. Carolina, bringing a bit the international organization and government perspective, how would you react to now seeing civil society and the private sector wanting to work together?
I think that it's absolutely fundamental, and maybe what I will do is take some of these comments and bring them to the example of Colombia. Because as you all know, in the year 2002, Colombia was seen as a failing state because of all the problems we had with our security and the violence, etc. Homicides were 35,000 a year. The situation was really very critical. And the way the country came across and was able to overcome this, and now is a country that's growing very, very well with a lot of foreign direct investment, etc., has to do with the kind of collaboration, good leadership. Clearly, you need good governance and good leadership, but the kind of support we got from the US, for example, which was a very balanced. People sort of seem to think that the support of Plan Colombia was only logistics and information, which it was and was fundamental, but it also had to do with justice and social economic development. But what the country also did, and as you were rightly saying, our middle-income countries such as Colombia and Latin America in particular are receiving less and less support. So we realized we all have to come together and carry out our programs. So we found a very active private sector, and it becomes more and more active. There was a special tax on wealth only to address these issues of security, which was highly accepted by the private sector. And then the private sector, when we started receiving some of the paramilitaries and the guerrillas who left the guerrilla and who were reincorporated, they came to work in their companies. As a society, we had to change our attitude because we had to change the basic situation for growth. And only until we were able to bring that greater peace could we really start talking about growth again, because Colombia had been a country that in the 90s, that was its lost decade. In Latin America, it had been in the 80s, and we had been growing well and had improved our, but by the year 2002, 10% of our population had left. We had negative growth, and our social indicators had gone down. So I think that what was being said is absolutely right. I think in addressing these issues of poverty, we find more and more that different kinds of alliances become fundamental, and that society as a whole has to identify with this goal. And even in this time, our budget for health and education was always higher than that for defense, which surprised many, many people since this was such a big issue of what we were carrying out. So I'll leave that sort of as an example of the way that we're all addressing, I think, the issue of poverty in a different way, looking at the basic problems we have that you have to overcome in order for growth to take place, and then how do you make sure that growth takes place and then is distributed so that you get greater equality.
In what you just said, all three of you, I may have a follow-up question. As part of these changes in the landscape, how do you feel about the fact that maybe the private sector, civil society organization and governments are putting a lot more emphasis on what I would call citizens, and the voice of citizens and delivering services to citizens? Do you feel this is an area in which the collaboration and innovation is taking place across traditional boundaries and challenging some of our normal boundaries? Ray, would you?
Yeah, but maybe I'll offer an opener, and Alex might come in behind this. One of the interesting things that happened some years ago was that Coca-Cola actually debated and approved a human rights charter internally for the company. And in the aftermath of that, there was a conversation that went on with Oxfam about, well, what is that going to mean for us as a company in terms of execution? And that started an interesting dialogue about citizen participation and how that might affect their supply chains and how their supply chains could be, in some sense, made more pro-poor, development-friendly, and sensitive to human rights. And there's an interesting case in Colombia that precipitated a lot of this discussion that I'm sure Carolina is familiar with. But I think this is, indicative of what's happening, I think, across the private sector and across many industries, where you're seeing more openness to tougher questions, more recognition that transparency and accountability may be business friendly, that it's more, there's very few places, one executive said to me, there's very few places we can hide on earth now that is where an egregious violation will not be exposed within 24 hours. So therefore, we've got to think a little bit more about our business models and our performance and some of these issues of transparency and accountability and human rights and how we incorporate citizen participation into our development models. And maybe just bottom line for us at Oxfam, for us really, the development question is really about power and about how citizens, the state and the markets manage that power question and how they share and distribute resources to the benefit and public good of citizens in whatever country. And how we manage that, I think, is a critical question that I think we need to debate in equal terms with how we think about things like fiscal policy that were discussed earlier.
Mm-hmm. I think, we are citizens, even though we work for corporations. People forget that. I often say we don't
have values, right?
Absolutely. We don't lose our humanity when we go to work. We are still citizens of this world. And citizens and people and consumers is how we describe it, have to be the center of everything we do. And unless citizens or consumers are the center, no matter what we do, it's not sustainable. And the key is that our work and activity, whether it's NGOs, governments, businesses, has to be sustainable. And therefore, you have to engage citizens, you have to engage the people. Our company is what we describe as a multi-local company. We physically reduce everywhere. And so we touch society at very fundamental levels. And we want to make sure we're engaging all the communities where we work. Because when they're successful, we're successful, and that's the key. As Ray suggested, we've done work with Oxfam in Zambia, in El Salvador, to really test the impact of our system on lower-income communities. And from their work, they were quite critical. They told us things we did well and things we didn't do well. We refined our supply guiding principles. We actually made changes to our business system to make sure that the impact of our business was more positive than not on the communities where we work. So citizens have to be the core, have to be the primary center around which you build your developmental programs. Otherwise, they're not sustainable.
I think, yes. The other thing that we're finding in Colombia now is that we have to be much more focused in the kind of programs. So that right now the government has a program called, it's a Department of Social Prosperity. And the program is focusing on different groups. So it's focusing on the early years, realizing that we need to get our children well-fed and with the basics to be able to then go on to education, et cetera. We're focusing, in our case also, on those who were the objects of violence or were displaced. So that's a group we're focusing because we realize they have a special condition. We're looking at the very poor, but we're also looking at our territories because we're also realize that there's certain parts of the country that require greater attention because there are areas where there's either greater poverty, and in our case, it has to do a lot with Afro-descendants and with indigenous communities, or areas where we're starting to consolidate the presence of the state. So I think one of the new things now, it's not just a poverty program, it's a very much focused program looking at the different parts of our society that require specific help. And I think this is a new way that we're now moving ahead in addressing this issue.
In your own commitments and your own activities, the areas that we have in common, and I have to say that working at the World Bank, I think the biggest difference for me over the last I've been there 20 plus years, has been the part in which we've moved from a really macro into a much more micro development model. But one of the things it also calls then for we are much closer to each other. We are on the same, covering the same ground in the same landscape. What do you see as the constraints to working better together or to better outcomes in the various, in your functions and in what you're witnessing right now?
I think although the collaboration between the players have improved significantly over time, there is still some skepticism in some of the civil society organizations about working with the private sector, suspicion about our motives. And so there's still an opportunity there to do a better job of getting rid of that skepticism. You know, we don't apologize for the fact that we are a for-profit organization, but we don't believe being a for-profit organization is mutually exclusive from doing the right things, from doing good. So I think there's an opportunity there to still work through some of the suspicions that, you know, occurs on both sides. But by and large, we see tremendous progress, tremendous recognition by all the parties on what everybody brings to bear. And the fact that together we can make a bigger difference than just working individually.
Maybe just to pick up a little bit on what Alex says, I mean, I think in terms of specifically the private sector and civil society, not-for-profit organizations, I think this is a whole new sphere for us in which we need to acquire an appreciation for what the sort of internal logic of companies might be. And so we've had to develop whole new skill sets, legal understanding of sort of legal issues as well as sort of business models, and find a sort of, I suppose you might call it a terrain for a common conversation. And what we've been challenged to do is really look at some of the fora where there have been discussions on global norms for corporate performance and be a participant in those, and be a constructive participant in those. And understand in some sense from the business point of view what their needs are as profit-making institutions and what our arguments are and how they might reconcile with that intent. But then in other cases actually find areas where there may be triple wins for business, civil society, and government. And I'll just give you one example. We are in a partnership with Swiss Re, which is interested in developing the insurance markets for Africa. And who would have thought that a not-for-profit like Oxfam would be working with a global insurance company and learning about insurance? But we are, but that's also brought us into a very complex set of relationships with Columbia University, which is doing satellite monitoring of crop losses in parts of Ethiopia. It's got us working with insurance companies in Ethiopia to deliver a product to small farmers in northern Ethiopia. Other not-for-profits in country that are participating in this, microcredit organizations that are actually working directly with farmer co-ops on the ground. And the government has a social safety net program that is actually, in the case of farmers who can't afford to pay insurance premiums, actually subsidizing that as people gain assets and then can become full participants in the insurance program. Swiss Re's interest in all of this is experimenting with different models of how insurance products should be and can be designed in a way that can be profitable in the African context, and how they might have to partner with African institutions, both government and not-for-profits, in order to initiate that kind of work. And in that case, we found a triple win, and it's working, I think, quite admirably. And now the World Food Program wants to take it to 4 or 5 other countries. So I think that's a case where we've overcome a lot of the kind of suspicions. We found commonalities in business model and values and goals, and I think there's a win in it for everybody.
So Carolina, maybe one of the elements, I think we all have worked with Swiss Re. around the one area which is in Colombia, certainly, which is around natural disaster risk management and building resilience. They're one of the leading companies in the world building basically insurance markets and products for risk mitigation. How do you see this? Ray and Alex have raised the issue of the issue of global norms. What do you see the role of the IDB, the World Bank, or governments also in pushing that? Because this is a one that we're all questioning, and I think you should also question ourselves when we take such initiatives.
Okay, I'll address some global norms, but I'm glad you asked me that, since I've now been working for the Inter-American Development Bank these last couple of years. And I think there's a very important role for the IFIs to play in the poverty. And it has to do, one, with, I think the banks can bring in additional resources to help the foundations and the governments who are working, which becomes very, very important. But the banks need to align better between the private sector. If they want the private sector to come in, the banks have to become more flexible, have to be able to manage risk a little bit better, not be so risk averse, and so work with some kind of insurances, et cetera, so that there's some alignment that needs to take place between the private sector and the banks. And I know the IDB is now trying, it had so many windows, it's trying to bring it together so that there's one window, is trying to see how they adopt much more a private sector model so that there's a common language. But I think the banks also play a very important role in that, for example, the cash, what are they called? The cash transfer programs. They can play a role in the development of these programs and then setting, these best practices, sharing them with other countries. And you find, for example, in Latin America, that the Bolsa Escola, which the World Bank started and which had to do with the subsidies for for keeping children in schools, then went on to Colombia and was adopted there as Familias en Acción, and then has gone to Mexico, and it's now in 17 different places. So I think the banks can play a role in carrying this kind of knowledge, understanding that in each place, they have to trust the governments and they have to work with the governments to make them specific for those countries. So I think that the banks have that important role. And then the third one has to do with measuring impact and evaluating. And I think that's very important because that gives these programs greater sustainability and greater strength, and the kinds of evaluations that are necessary are very good. So I think this is another very good partnership that needs to get underway, that will be working with the private sector, with the citizens and the governments.
You're raising the issue of innovation and then replication. Is this an area where you feel today in our landscape of both foreign assistance but private sector development, have we made progress in sharing innovation, in being able to cut across some of the traditional boundaries? If we're at the World Bank, we do this way. These are our processes. If you're at Coca-Cola, you do it that way. Is there something, do you see positive evolutions, or you see remaining challenges around that whole area? Because we've used good examples of collaborations and innovation, but can we do more? What do you think? Ray?
Well, I think it's an interesting moment, because I think some of the examples you've heard here indicate that boundaries are breaking down between our various sectors. That's good news for innovation, I think. I also think the bank has played an important role, as it's thought of itself more as a knowledge leader, and has become an extraordinarily open institution in terms of its transparency and its willingness to share a lot of its of its basic information. And I think it's a role model, I think, for many other institutions, even those of us in the not-for-profit sector. I think sometimes on the innovation front, we tend to think very much about technology, about seeds, tools, cell phones, and we don't think as much about institutional innovation, or what I might call soft innovation. And I think in your recent report, I think there was an interesting comment about the science of delivery, which I just thought was very intriguing and one that I'd like to embrace. And I guess what I take from that is we need to be thinking more about creative ways of doing institution building and dealing with governance questions, and how do we institutionalize things and concepts like accountability and transparency in countries? How do we create the mechanisms for engaging citizens actively on an ongoing basis in advisory bodies and what have you? How do we get to the subnational level institutionally? Oftentimes we've got the resources, we've got the ideas at the international level, but we're not penetrating to where the real need is at the subnational level. And I think those are going to be some of the frontier challenges that we're going to face in coming years in the area of innovation that are not purely technological, but are more about institutional innovation.
Karina, Alex, what did you?
I agree with Ray wholeheartedly. I think innovation needs to be in the soft areas. And I do think there are opportunities for us as institutions to get out of our comfort zones and understand we have to adjust and adapt how we think about things. The frameworks with which we approach development, we have to challenge the paradigms. And so I think there's an opportunity. I think we've made progress, but it has to be in the soft areas. I think the World Bank, for example, could play a critical role in helping to develop a repository of all of the different NGOs, all the development agencies, so you can have one-stop shop where you can go and say, if I want to do this work in Colombia, this is the best agency to partner with, this is the best whatever. That repository doesn't exist today. And I think World Bank can play a pivotal role in having this data where you can go online and get all the best partners, and it will just speed up the process of development if you know the right private sector company, the right civil society organization, the right government agency to work with. Wonderful, wonderful innovation, I think, could come from the World Bank if you did something like that.
Yes, I think that this is where I was going to pick up on that, because I think part of the problem is banks are siloed. So, for example, right now that I'm working at the Inter-American Development Bank on cities, we have to work with water and transportation and governance and fiscal, et cetera. And getting the bank to make that exercise is difficult for the bank. It wants to and it's doing it, but it's hard. And it also happens in our societies. You have foundations that are specialized in this area or that area, or the companies, and many times you don't have a place where you can bring them together, or where you can make sure that experiences you've had in one place can be taken somewhere else. So right now in Colombia, we're trying this new experiment. It's called the Social Program Trading Floor. And the idea is that businesses can bring all their programs, and even the government agencies. Many times government agencies don't know what the other government agency is doing, and we end up sort of replicating. They bring their programs, and the idea is that you have, these business meetings, and you can talk about experiences to see how you can bring this together. So there's a problem of having good information, of knowing who's doing what, and then how to organize and take advantage of that. So we're going to start mapping what different companies and what different foundations are doing in Colombia, sort of in that same way, so that we get a better picture of what's going on, and we can build on existing experiences instead of replicating them over and over.
You all three raised issues around transparency, accountability, institutions, governance. President Wolfenson made big headlines globally with the C word. It's now quite a few years ago. But recently, he said one thing that really struck me, which was that while there's been a recognition of the importance of fighting corruption, that maybe not the same energy and leadership that he did in the past. Do you see governance, corruption, and the fight around transparency, accountability, one of the key challenges that we're facing now for us all to be able to better work together? It's a tough one, eh?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have to work together to solve the problems of corruption. It's unfortunately the bane of a lot of the challenges in developing markets, in developing countries, is this whole idea of corruption. Now, I'm gonna be a bit controversial, but we also gotta put it in the right context as well. You could argue in the West, right? Some of the practices around lobbying and all that kind of stuff, it's kind of gray. So we have to focus on it. We have to do something about it collectively. We shouldn't tolerate it. It's not acceptable because, again, it just sucks resources out of societies. but we also got to put it in the right context and the right framework, and can't have double standards in terms of how we think about corruption.
Yeah, I think there is some good news and bad news about the corruption issue. I mean, I think there, Moises Naim wrote a book a couple of years ago which talked about sort of the black economy, sort of, and the scale of it, and and I think anyone who read that book would, I think, be quite worried. On the other hand, I think there's some very interesting things going on that are maybe not all that visible. For example, there are organizations doing budget monitoring, civil society organizations doing budget monitoring all over the world today. And there's a whole discussion now about should civil society go beyond simply looking at budgets and trying to think about budgets and think about now expenditures and how budgets are being expended and having more open public debates about those in countries. And should that also be focused on not only national budgets but also regional budgets? And should there be report cards about expenditures and whether commitments for expenditures are actually being met? And civil society groups are being trained in these new skill sets to actually exercise, I think, more participatory competence in this area. The tricky bit, though, is I think we're at a paradoxical moment globally. On the one hand, we have had this whole discussion about development effectiveness and the importance of ownership and the role of government and civil society at the national level owning the development process and donors stepping back and being collaborative and being supportive but not necessarily driving every intervention. Some of that has translated itself into the closing of civil society space to play an accountability and transparency role in various countries around the world. And I think, I don't know whether it was the US State Department, I think may have done a study some years ago in which there were some 90 countries in which there had been laws that were actually restricting the exercise of civil and political rights of citizens to be participating in these areas. So at a moment when we're talking about accountability and transparency and fighting corruption, we're actually legislating against the kind of advocacy that would actually get the best result. And I think and I just would underline, I think that's an area where in terms of global norms that are being discussed through institutional fora like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, great place to kind of talk about that across all these institutional lines and other similar kinds of bodies. There's, I think, opportunities for for-profits, not-for-profits to talk and work together in terms of thinking about these transparency and accountability issues and dialoguing with governments about keeping that space open. So I think there's some interesting opportunities for creative partnerships where I think there's a win-win for everyone. But I think the critical thing we need to keep focused on is we're not going to get transparency and accountability if the space to execute it is closed.
I think there's an additional challenge that's coming up now because we all realize that there are problems at the national government but also at the subnational, and we need to start working more with the subnational. And many times the technical capabilities, the administrative capabilities are not as good, and we have problems. So we not only have to look at the problem of corruption and transparency at the national government, but we also have to see how we can work more and more with the subnational level. And I think that's a challenge for the World Bank, for the IDB, et cetera. But clearly that's the way the world is going. Cities are playing a much more important role day after day. They're making relationships directly. They're not going through government. So I think there are whole new players also coming in that become very important in this discussion.
Thank you. Let me open the discussion to the floor. Can I ask anybody who wishes to pose a question to go towards the microphones? There's 3 of them there, or 4 of them. Please introduce yourself and focus mostly on questions and short comments if possible. Thank you. I'll start no political preference, but we'll start on the left.
I'm comfortable. My name is Robert Berg, World Academy of Art and Science. Some years ago, I suggested the creation of an international council for the Bretton Woods Committee, and it's been a great success. Now, as I think of new collaborations, I'm thinking about the relatively new, and very major international development banks that have arisen since the Bretton Woods institution, such as the Andean Development Bank and the banks in Brazil and China. And I'm wondering whether you have advice on how this committee could keep its focus on the Bretton Woods, but yet somehow incorporate their experience because they are now larger than some of the Bretton Woods institutions which we are supporting.
Yes. Thank you very much. If it is okay with the panel, I'll take a couple of questions so that we can then address them.
Good morning. I'm Lindsay Coates from Interaction, which is an association of U.S.-based NGOs. You have touched on the importance of, and Christiane Lagarde touched on the importance of women in development and leveraging development. And I'd like to pose a problem for you all and then ask how each of your sectors would need to change its current practices in order to address that problem. Reproductive health supplies often don't reach women, and they're critical in terms of women having autonomy over their lives. Other basic medical interventions often don't reach communities who need them. Coca-Cola is great at getting things as far as they need to go to the last mile of the road. NGOs sometimes struggle with, in an operational level, with getting supplies and necessary items to people who need them, and governments have an interest in seeing that health supplies and other things reach people. So thinking in terms of collaboration, how would each of your sectors need to change how you're working to address the poorest and most marginalized citizens at the end of the last mile?
Thank you.
Hello, good morning. My name is Dr. Elvira Barracochia, and my question is about another C word. It's competition. I believe that there is good competition that brings innovation, and there's also bad competition when you see NGOs not sharing information so they can win the next contract, the next project. So how can you enhance collaboration and really advance development and avoiding this practice? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a fourth one, or first round.
My name's Fran Graney. I'm with Deloitte. President Kim has articulated there'll be a one World Bank Group strategy, and there's two arms of the bank, or the bank, IBRD and IDA, and then IFC, which finances the private sector. And he said that there's he wants the bank to convert from a knowledge bank to a solutions bank, and readily admits that the bank doesn't have all the solutions, but they're outside of the bank and needs to be collaboration. So my question is, what role would the panelists see of the IFC playing in funding the private sector, particularly when a lot of good things and solutions are happening in the private sector, to be more targeted on scaling solutions in country or across countries and investing in private sector solutions? And obviously it's going to be a more risky investment. And do you think that would be a good role for IFC to play?
Thank you. This will be a very good question for Jim as well, along also the issues around the science of delivery. I am actually the vice presidency I head right now, which is external affairs, is actually merged July 1st with the IFC. So July 1st will be external and corporate relations across the World Bank Group. But that is not, that's a tiny little part of a much bigger puzzle. We turn to the panel in addressing, I think we have there 4 sets of issues that are quite complementary. Would you, maybe Carolina, would you like to start?
Okay, well, I'll start with the first one about the role of the regional banks. I think regional banks, the World Bank plays a very important role, but in the regional banks, for example, in the case of Latin America, the Inter-American Development Bank lends more money to Latin America, given its condition, than the World Bank does. And the CAF, which is the Andean Corporation, is also very, very active. And then we have our own development banks. Colombia has FINDETER, and Mexico has, its bank. So I think they do play a very, very important role, and they're good. In a way, what we're finding with the Inter-American Development Bank, as we're working with cities and seeing how they can be more sustainable, and we're working with the medium-sized cities, is that these banks speak the language, know the culture, and understand the situation. So they're closer, and it makes it quite effective. So I do think that they play an important role, and I think they play a complementary role with the World Bank, with the Bretton Woods institution. So I think that that's something that should be, or it can be encouraged, and can be very, very positive. Women and reproductive health supplies and how to reach the very poorest. clearly, we need to be looking at our most vulnerable members of society. And usually they're women, they're children, and now more and more our society, which was such a young society, older people.
Yes.
In Colombia, for the first time, we're thinking about older people, because since we had such a high birth rate for so long, we were always just worried about the young. And now our pyramid is changing, and we don't have the services for our older generation. And so this, for us, is sort of a new way to look at it. So I think in our strategies, we do need to start to always be looking at who are the most vulnerable, and are we reaching them, and what kind of programs do we need? And I think that's part of what is being done now. We have less supplies, and a lot of our society is moving ahead, but some groups are being left behind. How do we reach out to them? And I think that's absolutely fundamental. I'm afraid I don't have much to say about the IFC. I will leave that to somebody more knowledgeable about that.
Thank you. Alex? Maybe?
Yeah, I just will echo Carolina's point on the regional banks. I think at the end of the day, the more local you get, the closer to the market, the more effective you are. This takes nothing away from the World Bank or the IFC. But for example, we've had a project with the Inter-American Bank in Paraguay, a water project that the partial funding. We have projects around Africa where the ADB is involved in. They're just closer to the market, they're closer to the situation. I think that's the role. And of course, if the Bretton Woods Committee can help facilitate and accelerate what they do and share solutions, share knowledge, all the better. With regards to the distribution bottom of the pyramid, what I often say to people often ask, you can find a Coca-Cola brand in the farthest reaches of the world. And the reason why is that everybody makes a buck along the line. So capitalism works, right? And we do lend our distribution system, if you will, to provide. We have partnerships with Nets for Life. We distribute malaria nets. So we lend the distribution system, but at the end of the day, I think the value we bring is to help people build their own distribution systems and bring our knowledge to bear. And so we've done that in collaboration with the Gates Foundation, with Accenture, with the Tanzania trade stores in helping them get drugs. So we didn't use our distribution system, but we lent our knowledge. Accenture played a coordinating role, again, the partnership working, if you will. But that's how you make it happen, either to lending our knowledge or just understanding, even if it's a nonprofit, that if there's a financial incentive for people to distribute stuff, it will happen. And we shouldn't shy away from that, if you will. The other question was?
Do you see a big difference in terms of both the corporate world, and I think I'll lead into Ray, as the part that there may have been a long time ago a bit of a division of labor in which the last mile was always left somehow to civil society organizations or or governmental sector, but not the private sector. Do you see that part of what we're trying to achieve in development and what contributions we can make having changed significantly?
Well, I think as multinationals continue to look for growth, they're looking at the bottom of the pyramid, if you will. They're looking at the last mile. And so as they develop knowledge and processes and systems to reach those consumers, I think developmental institutions can leverage that. And we have many examples of where we lend our knowledge, we lend our actual distribution system to make sure we're doing the right things for those communities at the bottom of the pyramid.
Ray?
Okay, well, maybe on this question that was posed, the challenge, I think, of delivering quality health at the bottom of the pyramid, I guess I'd offer a slightly different perspective, maybe, or maybe a complementary one. First of all, I mean, I think we've had this in development. We've had this discussion about scale for some time, and within the NGO community, many of us have tried to grow our programs to achieve scale. But I think the truth of the matter is we never actually are going to be assured of having adequate funds to sustain massive delivery at scale indefinitely in country as international NGOs, or even I think in the case of domestic NGOs. Oxfam's basically started to look at this issue from a human rights perspective, and our vantage point is the duty bearer for providing quality health is the state in all countries. And we should recognize that. And I think we've suffered to some degree from over the past several decades of there being a severe critique of the state and the role of the state, and to some degree might even undermining the role of the state in leading on these issues. We would like to reinforce the idea the state is the duty bearer and in some sense responsible for the protections of its citizenry, and therefore should lead in terms of achieving scale. Then the question becomes, what is the problem you're trying to address at scale? And what is the role of Coca-Cola if it is disposed to be supportive? And what is the role of an NGO in a particular region of a country where there may be a shortage of reproductive health technologies or agricultural credit or whatever the particular need might be? But I don't think we should necessarily be assuming that we are the leaders in providing that core protection. We should be complementary to what the state is doing and what the social compact is in a particular locale. So I think that's the way we're viewing it, and for that reason, I think when we talk to colleagues here at the bank, I mean, we're reinforcing the idea that there should be more emphasis on public expenditure for these kinds of basic services in health and education. I don't know whether you want to move on to some of these other questions.
Sure.
Like, I'm quick. I'll take on the NGO collaboration one very quickly. Again, I think we're at an interesting moment in terms of this issue of, is there too much competition, and is there therefore fragmentation in development delivery and interventions? The good news there is, I think, with the whole global discussion about aid effectiveness, which is emphasizing greater levels of collaboration and getting rid of useless duplication imposed on countries in terms of reporting and all of this, that NGOs, as well as contractors and other participants, are now finding themselves being asked to participate in consortia fundraising arrangements. There's all sorts of new funding modalities that are emphasizing collaboration. And so rather than competing, we're finding ourselves talking to our NGO partners about, well, should we actually collaborate on this particular request for proposals on this health or education or agricultural initiative? So in some sense, I think that the emphasis in the global discussion on aid effectiveness, and with its emphasis on greater collaboration and streamlining approaches so that we're not creating onerous burdens on countries, is actually forcing us all to change our business models and do this work differently, and I think moving us away from sort of the traditional organization to organization competition, which I think is a good thing.
Yes. The only thing I would add, more tactically, I guess, is donor organizations can help facilitate that as well. And we have examples where we insist that organizations work together in certain areas to make sure we're not being redundant. And so to the extent the World Bank is a donor organization, you can play a role in helping to minimize that competition as well.
One of the areas we can certainly put as a burden of proof on the World Bank Group is actually this increased partnership, or the scoping and the opportunities for more partnership and better solutions between the private, public, and civil society sectors. I think we have to do a good job of that because we have those instruments integrated in one World Bank Group with a global reach. So I think it's both for the committee but also for all our partners is pushing us in that direction is very important. So, and I'm sure you will hear from Jim very much along the same lines. I'd like to take, we did touch really much on the IFC part, but I think that comment I was trying to make at the end is also a reflection of the panel. They will very much see that this is an area of continuous evolution and frankly speaking also of innovation. So I think this is probably an issue for future meetings as well. Can we take a second round of questions from the floor? Yes.
Gary Kleiman, Kleiman International. Now that you mentioned the IFC, what a good segue. And I'm directing this predominantly to Alex, a model from another beverage company quite recently I would like him to comment on. And here I'm not indicating any preference between alcoholic and non-alcoholic. Coors. Very recently, the head of Coors decided to start a big private equity venture capital fund focused particularly on low-income economies where there had been a lot of CSR focus, as with Coca-Cola. And this phenomenon had started earlier in the tech sector. Do you see this as more of a mainstream direction at Coca-Cola or other multinationals starting for-profit, maybe venture capital arms? And how do you reconcile this with the CSR focus and the outside industry of venture capital, which obviously provides some competition, but obviously has been a partner to you in this regard for years?
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Yes, my question is really in 3 words: Walmart, Disney, Bangladesh. And the question is, you have Walmart that is being criticized for being there, Disney being criticized for leaving 5 countries by Oxfam. Oxfam, I think, has made comments on that. So perhaps you can engage in the issue of what is the right thing to do and how to do it, and how different partners can play a role in this respect.
Thank you.
Thank you. My question has to do with collaboration and basically with all the different needs that we have been discussing, such as health, education, inequality, and political stability. And many organizations from different sectors, such as government, NGOs, and private sector as well. Which sector should take leadership on organizing all those efforts in order to have more efficient results and make sure that the biggest needs are being targeted, both at a country and a global level? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I have 2 quick questions. One is, what do you see the role of evidence and analysis in both identifying the innovations that work best and then scaling them? And secondly, there's been in the last few decades, a rise of organizations that break their binary for-profit, non-profit mold in social enterprises, and those who invest in them and back them, the impact investors. What do you see the role of this new business model and this new dynamic in the development arena?
Very good. Let me take, I think we'll be in our, if I'm not mistaken, in our final round of questions. Let me take the last one here.
Thank you. My name is Ben Hatch. I'm from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, also a former Peace Corps volunteer. We've talked a lot about accountability, and I just wonder if the panel could talk a little bit about, with a bunch of different actors who are traditionally accountable to different populations, how we answer the question of, as these organizations work together, to whom are we ultimately accountable for our actions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me suggest maybe that we take one area that we have not covered, and that's quite closely related to also the work of the committee, is the whole funding environment for development. And could we maybe look at the questions both from the private sector side, the private equity dimension, but also non-traditional actors. We mentioned before regional development banks, national development banks, but we are also, in terms of funding, for instance, at the World Bank right now, we've created a vehicle, AMC, that's related to IFC, to try to mobilize funding from pension funds, from sovereign wealth funds, for the purposes of development. Maybe start with that issue, and then the constrained environment on the public sector side, so among donor countries, and also the public at large. Maybe start with that part of the conversation and move into the other areas. Who would volunteer? Maybe
Well,
Alex?
since the first question was directed at me, I perhaps should start. And first of all, I would say, and maybe this is an obvious statement, but these different funding approaches and innovations are not mutually exclusive. I think we should encourage people to test and experiment with all the different funding methods. And the ones that work, we should replicate around the world, and the ones that don't will take care of themselves. So I think it makes sense to do all of the above. With regards to Coca-Cola specifically, we do encourage social entrepreneurship. We do help to facilitate it, but we're not in that business. So to the question about what Course is doing specifically, that's not what we would do. So we don't have any plans, at least not in the immediate future, to create a venture fund of the sort described. We, however, do encourage people, particularly women. We have this 5 by 20. We want to empower 5 million women by 2020 to do work around our supply chain, to produce things that we buy and consume, to sell our products. We treat entrepreneurship skills to them so they can empower themselves and their families and communities. So from that perspective, we are actively involved, but not in creating venture funds, if you will. So conceptually we're supported, but that's not something we're doing ourselves.
Thank you. Ray, is there a paradox to an extraordinarily difficult funding environment right now, at a time when actually probably it's we have the best evidence ever of strong development impact?
Well, in terms of the not-for-profit sector, what's happening? I mean, I think we're seeing diminished finance, and we're seeing more directed finance, and we're seeing more the increase of restricted funds and more results-oriented financing. And that's having, I think, a number of different impacts on the not-for-profit sector globally. One, just maybe just again talking about Latin America. Latin America enjoyed significant funding to its not-for-profit sector that I think helped it flourish over the last 3 decades or so. Much of that money is leaving, so you've got national think tanks that are important to national development priority setting that are underfunded. You've got human rights and transparency organizations that are, I think, experiencing difficulties. So you're seeing a kind of, in some sense, a diminished level of funding to that vibrant not-for-profit sector in certain parts of the world just because of the geographic shifts that are occurring. The results-oriented funding is producing a phenomenon in which you're getting more and more not-for-profit organizations that are being heavily leveraged by restricted funding, therefore driving out the potential for innovation, because everything is defined by the funding that's coming in, and therefore the kind of innovation that you might want to get at this particular point in time with more unrestricted funding is actually becoming diminished. And I think that's a phenomenon you're seeing across the sector, both here in the United States, just to take this country, but globally in terms of international not-for-profits, that I think is, again, paradoxical because we want more innovation, yet we're seeing this kind of reverse phenomenon. Which brings in the social venture question, maybe I'll touch on real quick, which is, that's an area which I think is good and healthy, and it's bringing in new money and for experimentation, and we should encourage that. And I think one of the things you're going to see is maybe more traditional not-for-profits developing sort of social venture dimensions to their portfolio, if you will, their portfolio of action. And then the question is how much money is really out there in the social venture arena that can be tapped, and can it reach the scale that we need and actually to make a difference?
Clearly, that I was going to pick up on what both of you had said. I think that's an area where there's new kind of funding, and it does allow for the kind of experimentation that sometimes the government can't undertake. Right now in Colombia, there are a series of social impact funds, and one especially big one. And for example, it was looking at the issue of getting finance for people who are in the informal sector. In our countries, that can be 60% of the people. So if you have a minimum wage, you can get a bank credit, you can get a house. If you're in the informal sector and you may have a much larger income, but you're not credit worthy because you don't have a set income. So for example, they worked out a whole new system by which somebody can come in and rent the house for 6 months, and they made an arrangement with the bank so that they become credit worthy by having shown that for 6 months or whatever they have been paying. So there are all these new experiments that have to do also with agriculture, and then how to have cattle and trees and get 2 businesses going at the same time with different. So I think this is a very, very exciting area that I think brings new possibilities, a lot of innovation, and so I think in the social impact, this is an area that is of great importance. I think I see a lot of leadership in organizing groups among the government. I think many times it's the government that can convene, but it's not the government saying. I think it's creating the space to convene. It's creating the venues to be able to talk about either different issues or different areas, et cetera. So in that question about in this cooperation, do I see a role for government? I really do. But not as saying, just as creating the environment, giving the information, and identifying some of the areas where it's necessary to get this cooperation going.
Maybe just we will be closing in a minute. Maybe any final words on addressing the questions we may not have touched? There was a question, Walmart, Bangladesh, the accountability, to whom are we accountable at the end of the line? And maybe also the evidence and analysis, which I think we've partially addressed. Final words, maybe can I start with you, Carolina?
Evidence and analysis. I think that an analysis is absolutely fundamental so that we can learn from our experiences. And as I said, I do think that banks such as the World Bank or the other banks have the capability of doing this analysis. But on the other hand, I think even in our countries, this is where we need to do it. And when we're talking about who are we responsible for, I think the private sector can be responsible to its shareholders, but also be responsible to its society. So I think we can't, I mean, that's sort of a divide that really doesn't exist. So I think all of us have this responsibility from our different roles. And we're probably responsible to lots of different people, but in the end, we're all responsible to our own society, to making sure that we keep on working on making this a society that is more equitable and more prosperous for everybody.
Ray?
Well, maybe just quickly on the evidence question. You know, increasingly in this collaborative environment, we are doing more multi-stakeholder initiatives. And when we do that, we're bringing together groups that have different values and different goals in these projects. And I think it's going to be more and more important for us to be innovating in this whole area of evaluation, monitoring, and impact assessment. And really asking ourselves, why are we doing this? In some sense, you know, are we doing it just to measure the outputs or outcomes of a particular project, or are we actually trying to learn at a higher level how change happens and challenge ourselves to think about what are our theories of change? Because if collectively we're actually coming to a greater degree of consensus about how change happens and how change can happen positively that is consistent with all of our organizational values, then we're going to end up in a better place. Whereas I think sometimes we may be a little bit too short-sighted, short-term, and pedestrian in the way we're approaching the pursuit of evidence. On the Bangladesh, Disney, Walmart question, Oxfam's been involved actually in this issue going way back to the early 90s when there were only 50 garment factories in Bangladesh. Now there are 4,000 plus in Bangladesh, and they're growing every day. I think there's a real challenge for industry in the context of a place like Bangladesh, where you've got a sector that's actually driven a considerable amount of growth in the country. It's benefited women in a very powerful way in terms of providing disposable income and having impacts on reproductive choices and on fertility issues and on family, quality of family life and nutrition and so forth. At the same time, the working conditions in which those women work represent sort of the bottom end of a supply chain for the garment industry globally that they have to be attentive to. And I think the discussion we've tried to precipitate is you really need to be sort of leveraging the influential powers that be in country that manage that industry, the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers Association, the Ministry for Development and so forth there, to actually be thinking about not only the working conditions, which actually where there's been some progress actually in Bangladesh, but actually the issue that I think is hardest for the industry are these questions of the building structures themselves and what the architecture of those buildings are and what the quality standards are. That's not necessarily something companies historically have had to think about when they don't own the building. They're sourcing from those companies, but they're not owning those structures. So I think really what we're going to see is more work on supply chains. And maybe the takeaway from all of this is that supply chains may be the area where there's real opportunity for conversation between companies and civil society in new and interesting ways that haven't taken place before, that are not necessarily combative, but actually complementary. And we need to find ways to enhance that dialogue.
Thank you.
I think just final comment, I think the Bangladesh question and accountability are very related. I think in today's social media world, we're ultimately accountable to consumers and citizens of the countries where we live and work. And so whether the Bangladeshis themselves or American consumers or European consumers punish the companies that do business in Bangladesh, the accountability, companies will be held accountable some way, shape, or form. So it's not just our shareholders, but it's ultimately the consumers that buy our products. And consumers today demand that we produce in a sustainable way, we make sure we're taking care of the environment. And so I think accountability today is not as big an issue as perhaps it was 5, 7 years ago, just because of how connected the world is today. And we do business in, something happens in Zambia or Senegal, and if it's not the right thing, we'll get punished in Japan. And I think that accountability keeps us on our toes, and I think it's a good thing. But it's a wonderful panel. Ray, nice to meet you. Carolina, enjoyed the conversation, and thanks.
Thank you to all. And very much in a few minutes, we will have President Jim Yong Kim and President Wolfenson joining us on stage. Thank you very much.